last week we actually got to share some resources that could help all the ones who are watching on our subject on, alcoholism and dealing with a relative or a loved one who's going through alcoholism. We're able to share some resources, some communities that really are there to help these individuals. Thank you for sharing on that. Just want to inform everyone that all these links to the communities are there in the description of the last live.
Wonderful.
Please do go check it out.
Yeah, and I'm excited to announce actually that we will have a very experienced member of Al-Anon coming to the program. And it will be a very interesting one because Al-Anon protects the anonymity, as we mentioned last week, very, very much. And so this member will not be able to be on camera, but we will be able to hear her voice and her wisdom and the stories that she has had access to. And I bet it will be a very moving interview. So we do these lives now and then, Rene. We are organizing more and more people to come on the live show, as it is such a wide topic all about trauma. So I'm looking forward to that one. Yeah. So yeah, go and check out the resources we left a link to last week. Very interesting topic.
Yeah, it was. If I could just share about a few things that we're able to cover and touch on that also topic, whereby we got to share and understand that alcoholism is not just an end to itself; it's a means to an end, and it
Oh
got to
yes.
share that very clearly that for most individuals, for many, actually I won't say for most, but for many right now, they don't see therapy as an option for different reasons we got to touch on, maybe culturally, maybe financially, socially, they spiritually, according to their beliefs, they did see it as any sort of an option for them. And now they feel the closest and, like you said, the most easily accessible things are the street drugs, as we were dealing with the last question, the street drugs or the alcohol. So these are individuals
Especially
who,
alcohol, I would say, right, which is so
yeah,
accepted in most cultures.
and like you said, and you got to share of your own experience with your uncle, how even though he was going through alcoholism, your experience with him, he was a very friendly, jovial person. And
Yeah.
the alcohol didn't get to change him, really, even as he was going through that suffering, of having to deal with that particular condition. So when he was an alcoholic, where he even as an uncle, he still showed up, and you had great memories with him. And it went through up until his last days. In fact, I'm glad you also got to share of the client um, who had a very hard situation whereby for the second attempt that they were trying to end their life, throwing themselves onto a freeway. At the last moment, they realized the inconvenience, and they still got to show their deep empathy for everyone else that they've always had. Even as they come to you, you're able to recognize that now, 2 attempts later, that they still have such deep empathy for everyone around them, and sometimes even at their own expense. That if trying to do what I'm doing will, break and also get to cause a big issue in your day-to-day routines. You're just going to work and then you see someone falling on the freeway as on your path. They felt that that's not who they are. They don't want to be that inconvenient, so they didn't do it. So getting to realize that all these conditions doesn't change the person who they are, whether they are friendly, whether they are deeply empathic, it was a really good point that I'm glad that we can reiterate on this live. So on this next question, the same question that we're on again, if you would allow me, Nicholas, to share a question I have for this particular question again, in that
Yeah.
I'm curious
Before you
for the,
do,
yeah,
your sharing has triggered several things in me that I like to comment on. So the
absolutely.
first one, as you were speaking, I had this image of me being in Verona, which is the city of Romeo and Juliet in Italy, where I went back when I was 17 And therefore I left Rome, where I used to live, and with this uncle or relative used to live also. And at that time, he started to call me quite often. It was very expensive at that time to call between regions, even within the one country. We did not have the internet yet, actually. So he would call, and I knew they were very expensive calls, and he would call often, and he would want to connect with me, and he was funny, and he would ask me questions about how life was going. You know, this was really a person that was really desperately attempting to form a bond, desperately attempting to form a bond. And he knew that I was someone very sensitive. He knew that I was someone, I guess, very much in need of a bond. Unfortunately, as it happens with many of these attempts, when you're traumatized, we're very selective about the people and the situations that we try to repair our bonds with, and we do it in a malfunctioning way. I was by far the least available person to him. I was totally driven by trauma. I had already started my way out of Italy. I would be moving from one house to another one again and again, one city to another, one country to another. Of course, having to adapt to so many different environments. So it was just absolutely impossible that we would ever be able to continue our relationship of connection. But he was hanging on it very desperately, because both him and I had the same need to repair something fundamentally cut or broken within us, which was the bond of love with our parents. He had had a cut with his own father. I had had a cut with my own father. So we shared, right, these trauma bonds, as we had discussed initially in these lives. So that image came to me, and so this, what I want to highlight here is that is the desperate attempt to repair a bond, but how so very often, almost very predictably, it's going to be an attempt that is malfunctional. It's going to be selective of a person where real bond is impossible. So there is this desperate attempt to repair and bond with an object or a person who will never be able to give you that bond. That's so typical of trauma bonds, whether it's with a bottle, with a person, with a partner. So that came to mind. Another thing that came to mind about the nature, not the nature that you were mentioning, it being changed or not. I came across a book on ethics, and the author of this book discusses his days in the Vietnam War. And he says, I want to read a couple of paragraphs to you guys. He says, among us in the army were some who recoiled, shrunk at the thought of killing a civilian, even to save their own skins, even in situations where it would mean that they might die. Okay? There were some who delighted in the freedom, when they were given it, to shoot down innocent people. And then there were a lot of people like me who were not sure what they would do in a crisis, in times when you are in this fight and flight sort of position, right? And then he says, I'd asked the 18-year-old door gunner whether he liked his job. So, on helicopters, you have these huge machine guns and you have a person who shoots, right? And he asked him, do you like your job, right? And he had told me that he did. And here's why. Sometimes the pilot flies low over the boonies. The boonies is a derogatory term used for the Vietnamese locals, right? Over the boonies, and lets me shoot up some hoochies. And hoochies was the word for the big bullets that were being shot, with innocent people in them. Surely he knew it was wrong to kill innocent people. It was a forbidden pleasure. He grooved on it, and its being forbidden made it all the more exciting. And I think this is so relevant to the psychology of addiction. It is somewhat a forbidden pleasure, you know, but it makes it all the more exciting. What kind of view of the world do you have to construct to be able to take pleasure in shooting innocent people from high above ground, right? It's an incredible position of power. You are in the position of God, literally, right? You're deciding the life of the or the death of innocent people, including children down there, right? So you're God. Why would you need to be God if Earth is an experience that is closer to paradise or closer to content and pleasure and happiness than it is closer to hell? I think only a person who has experienced hell in childhood would need to become a god on earth with that kind of device. So it's an hypothesis here that I'm putting out there for people to discuss under in the comments, right? The need for power in the form that is expressed in this 18 years old man or young man indicates that he comes from a place where the world is already hell, not just in Vietnam, right? But in his head, wherever he goes, in his heart, in his body, wherever he goes, right? So that's another thing that came to mind as you were speaking. So you're most welcome to ask your question now, and I'm happy to answer it.
Wow, I think that's what you said is heavy, and I just can't help but respond to it, whereby here in the first point of when someone who's traumatized, they're really trying to build a relationship in a very malfunctioned way, whereby you're trying to connect with something that will never give you back that same connection. And this individual who wants to feel like God, and I'm trying to maybe try the two. I'm wondering, for this, what's it called, the door gunner, how many quote unquote Uchis does he have to release to make him feel satisfied? How many? Because the Uchis won't give him connection, the gun won't give him connection. He's trying to really connect with the gun every time, but it will never give him that sense of you are all powerful. You're not. He will not be the most powerful person in the battlefield. And how many times will he have to do it in order to feel that I'm actually now content? It really is. And connecting also with how you're saying that your uncle had to call you, and it was very expensive to do that. I'm imagining this individual signed up to the military and traveled across the world to Vietnam, because I don't think his country is anywhere near Vietnam.
The
He
USA,
signed up.
yeah, not near, yeah.
Those are two different continents. He signed up, went all the way across the continent,
Yeah,
across the world, to be able to get this feeling, to
yeah,
finally feel like he's
yeah.
satisfied. So, and
And
it's
there
still
is,
not enough.
if I can stop you there is an inherent contradiction to that position of power and connection with the pilot and shooting, and what he's shooting. He cannot fill up this sense of power, because ultimately he's shooting beings that he doesn't know, that he reputes to be less than human, right? So in a way, in his mind, he's shooting down enemies, but those enemies are not real. There is no such a thing as innocent people being enemies, you know, normal villagers being enemies and being something real. So it's only really a film that is being played in the imagination. So reality is completely disconnected from the mind of that person. And that's exactly what alcoholism, or let's say an addicted person, brings to the table in a family. There is a divorce between their sense of reality and the internal sense of reality, right? The external sense of reality and the internal sense of reality. So this gap, this cut off between what is happening within me and what is happening outside, that is the trauma, that is the suffering. That is what I'm trying to feel in and transcend and convert into a connection. And yes, it doesn't happen.
Well, and I think, yeah, it's a very strong point whereby you can see the disconnect of when someone is like drunk, they feel like they're in a happy place. And the same way this individual, when he's done his, I don't know, his task or routine, he feels, I've defeated the enemies. I defeated so many enemies today, but they are not enemies. They weren't shooting at you back. You know, the boonies that you're really like, even how you said this derogatory now word, boonies don't exist. It's just like part of the cast in his own imagination.
Yes.
The fact that he can't call them children or human beings or Vietnamese, which they are, he calling this word boonies, could you say it actually also emphasizes this character that we have of boonies are these violent people that need to be exterminated or
I like what
violent
you said,
things.
because it shows how we can create these entities that there's no such a thing as a boonie in the world, right? Yeah. We can never find a boonie, but we have created linguistically this idea in the mind, and now we act out of this story that we're playing in our minds, and it only exists here. It's maybe shared with a few other people, a very small niche of people with enormous technological power, but it's only here, right? So where do we find love? Where do we find compassion? Where do we find calmness? Where do we find the most beautiful aspects of human life, the most beautiful emotions? We always find them in places where we feel safe, and places where those environments of safety include other people who also feel safe. And in that environment of safety, they ask us to pass them a glass of water, or to do something with us, or to tell a joke or a story, or to play a board game, or right, like in a safe environment, two people come together and they're so relaxed that they can access the pain of their life and share the pain of their lives. That is connection. So as soon as we move to environments that are not safe for both cannot be in that parasympathetic nervous system activation that we often talk about, which is a relaxation of all your organs, your breathing, your heart rate, your stomach, your muscles, right? It's putting yourself in a place where your body is able to welcome, because it feels it has abundant resources to welcome the pain that my friend has, that my partner has, that my child has. Yeah. So the whole, as you say, this person traveled from USA all the way to Vietnam to being in places where they were absolutely very, very, very unsafe. So nothing can connect there. But I like the analogies you're making to this person with the addicted person. This is very, very, very good and profound. So please go on a little bit if you have more to say.
Yeah, and I think when you just show about connection, I'm seeing we're just quite pressed for time, but I really feel that we needed to get to it as it was. But maybe I can just mention just one question for the sake of the audience, and that I was going to share. The next you can carry on. Thank you for that sharing. All I wanted to ask is, you mentioned connection, and on this question, I wanted to know, how does this particular experience of having a caregiver who is drink, how does it affect the connection that the child feels? Because here we are not talking about the other questions. We're talking about the emotional abuse, the physical abuse, the neglect. Could we categorize this under neglect because we don't see any direct harm in the question?
Well, first of all, we absolutely cannot generalize, because while an addiction will not change the sort of innate nature, I believe, okay, this can be criticized. What I'm saying right now can be criticized. So please go on in the discussion if you think differently, argue your point. But while I think that the innate nature will not be, you know, really changed by the addiction, behavior is changed. We become less able to regulate emotionally. For example, one small but very important consequence of addictions is that they are going to disrupt your sleep. If I disrupt your sleep, I disrupt your ability to regulate your emotions. Why? Because your cognition, your prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that sits, mostly here in the prefrontal region, but all over the brain, that allows you to basically suppress the intensity of certain emotions, goes offline, as we say. That part, this layer of the brain, which is the part that has evolved most recently in evolutionary times, is kind of offline. Its power is not switched on. So all the ancient emotions, the primal emotions of our mammalian brains, the fight and the flight and the freeze responses, are much more alive and much more able to drive behavior. So while it doesn't change the innate nature for sure, but it doesn't mean that even a good person cannot end up doing very violent things or insult their family members or put them down in one way or another, or freeze and be numbed and not being there in one or another way, which means then neglect, right? And as we said, at the end of the day, if you're deciding to take the bottle and drink and be kind of in a hazy state of mind for an hour instead of spending that time with me, that teaches me that in the world I'm not worthy even a bottle, right? My worth is less than €2 a beer bottle, right? So terrible things can be experienced by family members and children of alcoholics and people with addiction. We don't normally speak of abuse, but of course there can be physical abuse. Plus, again, let's reiterate, not everyone has an innate soft, gentle nature. There are people, like I read in this paragraph, who take pleasure in hurting others, right? Who take pleasure in dominating and being violent. I'm not saying a fundamental pleasure, because there again, I stand on the belief that ultimately, if you're taking pleasure in hurting people, either there is something neurologically sort of damage, like the neural pathways are wired in a way that we would call, pathological, like there is a different wiring in the brain, or if there's no different wiring and the brain seems normal, then to me there must be heavy trauma for you to experience that pleasure. So in the case of the gunner, that's my first argument. I would immediately go into his family experience. Right? Maybe he comes from a military family, living in a Texas small town of the USA, where the culture is very harsh. Maybe he was a very sensitive person. Like, my immediate guess, and usually I'm right with these assumptions, would be to go there. I think the short answer is heavy things can happen, even to people who have a good innate nature in the state of change when they consume the drug.
All right, and I think that's a good way to wrap up for this question. That ideally, innately, we understand that your innate nature also doesn't mean that you won't have some situations whereby um, things are heavy and you behave in a way that doesn't coincide with who you are. And I think that also the fact that we have to go back to understand people's history and people's background to understand that
Yes.
the context of what they're doing, because it's good that you clarified from the beginning. We can't generalize. We can't make
No.
a whole blanket statement about this particular situation.
No.
So for this question, I think I'm quite satisfied with that answer. I believe that on the next live, just to release for those who are watching, it's a bit of overtime, but for the next one, the next two questions, we will get to understand the context of these kind of individuals when they have an innate nature, not just harming others, but how they do they perceive how they treat themselves, how they harm themselves, and how, as a child, you see someone who has a good innate nature but doesn't want to be treat themselves well. So I would really encourage all of you to stay tuned for our next live next week. We do not have another guest this week, but thank you again for Nicholas for taking us through these questions and sharing this analogy. I also suggest everyone to take the ACE test. The QR code has always been there on our live, and also you can support our activity this live by buying us a coffee. Thank you again, Nicholas, and until next time, we can talk soon. Bye bye.
Bye bye, guys. Bye, everyone.